Om. Om Tat Sat. Om Satyanandam. Om Paravak Shakti. Om. God speaking directly to God, about God. Om. Bless this convergence in all its phenomenal aspecting, seen and unseen. Om, the 12th live stream teachings of SATYAVEDISM. Om, entitled Om Satya, Effortless Non-Believing Without Resistance. Lssv 12. Om, this teaching is in reference to cardinal teachings Lssv 10 and Lssv 11. The matter speaking upon the 5 primary obstacles to self-realization obstacles, and 5 primary misidentifications in the pseudo-egoing processing. That's 10 and 11. So please refer to these teachings. Now, some meta information. God transitioning God-lang into technical God information. Lssv teachings, some teachings will be extracted for conversion into SSV teachings to enumerate and elucidate in a more concise fashion the more expansive Lssv teachings. So various information is to be selected and morphed back into SSV formatting. Enumerated listings, what would be called bullet point pointings, lists. Lssv teachings are more expansive and flowing in format or lack thereof. They're more oceaning of God information. But the extractions are to make that information available in concise format as well as SSV. Distillations, concentrated information. Also, welcome to God in the form of God myself, being introduced to the teachings and explore, absorb, immerse in God consciousness in the teachings. God whole willing, there has been rectification of turbulence in the dissemination of Lssv teachings. That has made it Om now more concentratedly centralized and expanding. There now should be sharing of the Lssv teachings, these live stream teachings of SATYAVEDISM. Via God Intel Tech networkings, otherwise aka spoken as God in the form of social media profiles and what are called groups, Om. So please disseminate this God information as it is found useful to expand the propagation. So all such seeming obstacles have been removed, and the teachings are now actually propagating in improved fashion. Om. The live stream teachings are to increase in frequency and prolificness. As these obstructions seemingly are now lifted. There is also to be live Q&A, question and answering seeming sessions within live stream teachings. Not every live stream teaching. Each live stream teaching is to vary in formatting, but as the live stream teachings have mentioned, live question and answering is one of the aspects of the live streams, as well as response to Ask Satya questions that are also submitted via other means. So seemingly have what is called patience, because this those formatting of teachings shall occur. God whole willing. Again, many teachings of the live stream teachings, many teachings, many manifestings, and many techniques for God realization. Om. End of technical God information in God Lang Om. Now is Om. Nothing has ever happened to you as God Absolute. Absorb. Absorb. Om, again, nothing has ever happened to you as God absolute. Om, God. Om, God absolute. Om, Parabrahman. Om, Parashiva. Om, God freedom. Beyond freedom. God beyond. Beyond, beyond. Om, God. Beyond awareness. Beyond consciousness. Beyond God manifestation. Yet, God manifestation is God within God, absolute. God transcendent, yet God immanent. There is no freedom for a phantom entity that does not exist. There is no identification with pseudo-egoing processing that claims the identity of an agency of I with endless narratives. There is no interest in asking about or receiving information about body timelines and body histories and the story of my life, and tell me about yourself. And tell me about others. There is no need to feel and believe in being a person in order to function, in order to have the functioning occur. Natural functioning. There is no need to have belief in all of the pseudo-egoing thought content, or to perpetuate that content in various forms as activity. All the functioning continues to manifest quite naturally, without any belief whatsoever in any of it. Without any fears arriving whatsoever. Beyond fearlessness. No fear, no fearlessness. Beyond. Functioning occurs. Functioning happens. Whole functioning, not individual functioning. Now, all belief can be dropped entirely. All belief in all thought content can be dropped entirely. There can be functioning without any belief in any content whatsoever. But the primary misidentification, the main reoccurring misidentifications of pseudo-egoing processing are elucidated to attempt to seemingly begin this deconstruction of believing, because those are primary beliefs. So that those start with those beliefings, because they are so seemingly persistent, those beliefings. So seemingly hard-coded. The programming. But all is malleable. malleable plasticity of networkings. So this is the discarding, the ignoring, the discarding, the vaporizing of all seeming limitations. There are in fact no limitations whatsoever. This is seemingly within seeming dreaming. To throw off those seeming limitations, to become the limitlessness that you are as God. Bound by no thoughts whatsoever. But there has to be willingness, God willingness, to disengage from all such thought content, to not believe it. Now in Lssv 11, SSSV 68 was referred to as the practice of non-identification with the five primary misidentifications. Again, to be restated: 1, person, individual identity, or belonging to a 2, body, gender, race, species, 3, group, collective, aggregate, 4, country, planet, location, 5, history, period, and time. So refer to Lssv 11 for more specifics. Now to go in further to this. To what, or to whom, but rather to what? Are various thoughts referring? To which I do they refer to? Is it the body I, which is not yourself? Or is it God I, the true self? So when thoughts occur, the question might be asked, to what does this refer? Or if there's still pseudo-egoing, it would be to who does this refer to? But you have to be pulling out of pseudo-egoing. So the question is, to what does this refer to? To what does this refer? If it's to the body, then it's not a thought about you, because you have no limits. So is the content body consciousness? Is it indicative of body consciousness? Or is it indicative of species-centric information? If it is, then it is not about yourself, God, yourself, God, the Absolute. So now there's the introspection and extrospection. Now this is what it is seemingly introspection. It is seemingly extrospection. What feels like that, but is not. In actuality, it is not. Because there is no inner and there is no outer. It is all seamlessly whole, God whole. Only thought divides. Thought creates a projection upon reality and divides and seems to segment up reality. And in doing so is dreaming. So it is about the removal of that seeming projectioning to see God reality as it is, as yourself, as seamless whole. So body and all of what seems to be other objects, etc., are all seamless whole in God consciousness. So it is not your body. It is a seamless whole. Without any segmentation whatsoever. So, but what feels like or seems like? 1, introspection, extrospection. Introspection feels like going within and looking at the mechanisms of thought and feelings and visions, etc., seeming to arise in God consciousness. Extrospection is seemingly to look at and to investigate what is seemingly going on outside of seeming body, meaning all the rest of the seeming world. So that's 2, internal or external. Again, that's the correlation. 3, incoming or outgoing. So content being inspected from those seeming perspectivings. Now, 1, as the body seemingly is inactive, disengaged, thoughts occur. So there's the investigating of those thoughts. Again, beyond also thoughts, feelings, sensations, images, being investigated. 2, the body seemingly is active but disengaged, investigating those thoughts. 3, the body is seemingly active and engaged, and there are seemingly incoming thoughts to be investigated. 4, the body is active and engaged, and outgoing thoughts, or about to be outgoing thoughts, are investigated. And 5, the body is active and engaged and conversing thoughts are investigated. So again, one refers to what would be called meditation basically. The meditation that involves, the sort of pseudo meditation actually, that involves the body seemingly in a position alone without engaging in outer activity. Stationary, without incoming input, etc. So that's what is called meditation. The thoughts are witnessed. So the observing of what sorts of thoughts are processing through consciousness, what the nature of the thoughts are. And primarily, most of the thoughts that occur have to do with being a person, have to do with belief in being a person, and have to do with body activities that the person seemingly needs to execute, or thoughts about other bodies, other seeming persons within other bodies, etc. And all sorts of emotions, feelings within the seeming body can arise while those thoughts are processing, because there is belief in them, in the thoughts. If there were no belief in the thoughts whatsoever going on, and there was simply observing the thoughts and not engaging them in the thoughts whatsoever, the thoughts would dissolve. A thought would come, a thought would go, without any engagement. If there is engagement, then there's propagating of other thoughts that occur, that come as a consequence of those of belief in a particular thought. They proliferate. And then soon there can be a seeming storm of thoughts occurring, instigated by belief in just one thought. Hence dreaming. So one, while in seeming meditative, inactive, disengaged with thoughts. Of course, it's optimal that it would be without thoughts. There'd be meditation and no thoughts whatsoever, seemingly. But the fact that those thoughts actually occur gives the opportunity to investigate the thoughts in order to discard them, thoughts, and start to dissipate such thoughts from reoccurring. So every seeming time a thought comes up, it is actually an opportunity So yes, eventually there is to be meditation with no thought whatsoever, in which case it no longer is considered meditation. But as long as the thoughts are coming and arising, there is investigating of the content. And then again, the content, if it's of the nature of the 5 primary misidentifications, then those thoughts are not to be followed, they're to be dropped, because those thoughts are not referring to your true self. So 1, during meditation, inactive, disengaged thoughts occurring, investigate. 2, active, disengaged thoughts occurring. So this would be if the body, God in the form of the body, is seemingly moving around in various capacities, mobile, moving around. But disengaged, meaning there is no seeming contact with seeming others in any speakings. There is just movement and activity. So what would be called silence and there are to be teachings about silence quite extensively, because practicing seeming silence expedites these inquiries and also limits sensory overload of unnecessary fiction content. Again, that's to be elucidated. So while the body is active and is disengaged, there's investigation of thought content. 3, again, active, the body is active and the body is engaged. There are incoming thoughts. So incoming thoughts might be various seeming God in the happening of media. For instance, there is reading or listening or watching occurring of thoughts manifesting in text form or through auditory, etc. As example, what is called television. Example, what are called movies. Example, what is called social media information. The various ways that information can be met and processed. So while there is active body activity and engagement in incoming thoughts, the incoming thoughts must be investigated for content. What is the nature of this content? To what does it refer? Is any of this information having to do with the 5 categories of misidentification? Again, if so, drop, disengage from it, from false information, from fictional content, from limiting information for believing. Drop it, disengage. There is much information that is not of a fictional nature. Again, that is to be elucidated extensively in teachings. God, truth, content. 4 is the body seemingly is active. Again, this is all within dreaming. The body and all. This has to keep being referred to because God, truth, is always being expressed. There is never any seeming covering of God, truth, while any of the integral methods are being explicated. So 4, the body seemingly is active and engaged in activity. Engaged means engaged in activity. It's engaged meaning some phenomenon is being concentrated upon in some way, even if it's not seemingly one-pointed concentration. It could be unfocused concentration, but still there is activity. There's still engagement with it. outgoing thoughts. Now, outgoing thoughts is when, basically when there is incoming, and then there is response to seeming incoming, outgoing, response to, whether it's seemingly static incoming or not. There's a response, seemingly. So that leads to seeming outgoing thought. So as the thought, before it actually manifests outwardly, there should be investigation of what is to be manifest. Is it species fiction? Is it about belief in a pseudo-personality? Whether it seemingly is, quote, yours or, quote, another? Because if that information goes out, it adds to fictioning, if it is. Or the seeming sharing of information that is about pseudo-identity. It adds to the collective dreaming. And it also shows belief in it. It shows belief in the thought if it goes out. Because if there had not been belief in the thought, it would have been dropped. So there has to be investigating of the thought about to go out, and then investigating of the thought as it manifests. And that can happen seemingly very quickly. So this is slowing the process of thought down in order to investigate it. And in the slowing of it seemingly down, it's actually creating seeming space for the real self that's always there to become more and more apparent to itself. So there should not be any pseudo thought processing about complaining about having to slow the process down, as in such thoughts as this process is taking too long. It makes things harder to flow. Because if the flow is fiction flow, then what is the purpose of any thought or speaking at all? What is the purpose of communication? So yes, it'll seem to slow down. And seemingly, eventually, there is no limitation on thought flow. It can be slow. It can be lightning speed quick in eternity. Because thought can be, through God omnipotence, thought manifests in many seeming different ways and can be controlled or let go and not controlled. But thoughts do not control you. You control thoughts. You, as God, have freedom and choice to drop any thought, just like that. This process may seem to be slow, but it will be expedited. So much so, it'll be to the point where it'll seem to happen without even thinking about it. So it is very important in step 4 of seeming outgoing thoughts. And 5, the body seemingly is active and engaged, and there is conversing thought, meaning there it seems to be a back and forth exchange of information, otherwise what is called communication, and it is seemingly felt to be in real time, back and forth and back and forth. Of course, again, these thoughts, the thoughts are processings all within God consciousness. Seemingly in God, is within God consciousness, and it is not outgoing or incoming. It is all taking place, happening, occurring simultaneously in the same seeming space of God consciousness. So there's no conversing going on. There's no discourse. It may seem to be so in fiction, in the dreaming. So again, these 5 is sort of a chart. To use for investigation, as to be extracted and occur as a Lssv teaching to which to refer. So those are some basic, seemingly some basic situationing where there would be investigation of thought content during activity, non-activity, during seeming speaking, during not speaking, during seeming exchanging of speaking, during just thoughts occurring without seeming any context, during meditation, etc. The whole spectrum or range. So if there is incoming thought content, seeming thought content, and it's referencing what seems to be you, then it is to be dropped or ignored. Now, it can be acted upon, but not as a person. There can be occurrences that happen because of that information that seems to be incoming. There can be response to it, but not as a person. The response will happen naturally. Response always happens naturally. Now in eternity. So there shouldn't be any worry, pseudo-fictioning, pseudo-ego fictioning, worry content about seemingly how do I respond? How can I speak like this? How can have a conversation? How can blah, etc., etc.? How is that going to happen? It seems to be a limitation on speech. What's going to be talked about, etc. None of that needs to be addressed, because it's all the pseudo-egoing, projectioning what might occur as a consequence of this investigation, and the fallout, the outcome of the investigation, of going into this and actually taking it seriously enough to want to know the true self as direct. It is not about believing. None of this information is about believing in it. But there is something intuitively known that to go into these teachings and actually seemingly practice the teachings, that something will be revealed as true. That it is not all for naught. That it is not a philosophy that can be taken up and dropped. It is actually about knowing reality directly. Now, what is called in fiction leaving the matrix, that is a social seeming trope within fiction, and it is misunderstood on many levels within the dream. What that means, getting out of the matrix, leaving the matrix, and what matrix means at all. But if there is any feeling that any of that seems or feels real, that there is a way to leave, quote, leave the matrix, to get out of what seems artificial or not real. Yes. Yes. But what you think is yourself, if it is not true self as God's self, it cannot leave. It dissolves with the matrix. There is no freedom for a pseudo-self. There is no pseudo-self that gets enlightened. The virtual self dies. Game over. You have to be willing to allow that pseudo-self to die. And no, this is not about suicide, etc. If there are any thoughts of a seeming pseudo-self being real and having agony and suffering from that seeming pseudo-self, the way out of that is not to end the body. That is not the way out of the matrix, quote unquote, suicide of a real seeming body. That is not the way out. And it is never to be condoned by these teachings of SATYAVEDISm. In fact, it is quite the reverse. all God manifestation is sacred and holy. It must be continued. The phenomenal aspecting, the actual structuring, what seem to be objects or seemingly our bodies must be treated as sacred, but not separate. The whole sacred reality. It must never be transmuted before natural occurrence. So let this be stated. The pseudo-egoing, what seems to be in fiction, the self that wants to get out, wants to escape. That self has to be vaporized along with the matrix, along with the dream, because the dream is a superimposition upon reality. There is nothing to escape from. That longing is wanting to know the true self as direct. That is all of that longing is. The self-realization, quote unquote, self-realization seems to be a major step, but it is not the solution. God realization is about realizing the whole and how the God manifestation works within it. And also God transcendence, being beyond the whole manifestation. But self-realization, seemingly, yes, it is a major step. Seemingly, a major seeming step. And there might be seemingly stopping there for seeming God in the form of seeming. Some might think that that is inadequate. But there is no journey. So again, if there is reference to the pseudo-self or to species fiction, etc., then there needs to be response. If the seeming processing is occurring and it starts to become obvious that there is truth in the dropping of these various forms of thought processing, but there still needs to be response back, seemingly, to incoming information, expecting response. Again, this is to naturally occur, but there has to be reference to the other methods of SSSV 58. In the usage of Godlang, either implicitly or explicitly, in order for response to occur, effortlessly without the continuation and propagation of fictional talk, speak, and thought. So now, some major primary dreamings and imaginings and thoughts, visions, feelings are being enumerated. So, Om. So there are various thoughts and feelings and sensations. So here are some seemingly common ones in the fictional dream. Anxiety, worry, expecting, and waiting. So these are all of a seeming kind. These are sort of futuring, fictional futuring. This is a pseudo-ego processing, looking forward to some sort of eventing, either in a the body sensationing of contraction, or the body sensation of expansion. So all of these thought phenomenon content sometimes have corresponding body sensation manifestations. So if, because sort of refrain from using polar wording of negative and positive feelings, because there are none. They're actually sensations. So, and there is nothing negative or positive. All of that is just, again, thought fiction. So what would be considered anxiety and worry would be that the body contraction, the body has a feeling of unsettled, contractioning, discomfort, and then expecting, waiting, or whatever. Some of that could be actually anticipatory, what might be considered happiness, or something about an anticipated eventing or whatever. But again, it is basically fictioning, it's projection, because eventing always occurs now in eternity, and it always occurs as it does, not as expected. So so those primary dreamings, imaginings of the anxiety, worry, expecting, waiting, and such. Then there might be sadness or depression, quote unquote. So this might be caused seemingly by pseudo-egoing, thought contenting about the processing about what would be called pasting, of having thoughts and memories coming up about seeming past events that, because there is no past, so it's dreaming. And then having a reactioning occur because of the thought processing. Belief, again, all of this is because of belief in the thoughts coming up. If there were no belief at all, then it would not manifest in the body as any feelings from it, from the thought content. The thought content would just happily bubble by and dissolve. So it's all about engagement. It's engaging the thought content for continuance because of believing. You have to see this very clearly in the witnessing of it. You as God are creating reality. You as God manifest. God manifest. So if there is believing in the fictioning, then there will be manifesting, and there is feeling that is seemingly manifest in the body as reactive. It becomes very clear that everything, that all phenomena you as God are creating all of it. So if there's believing in that thought content, then it has ramifications, because you as God are omnipotent. You as God are that powerful. All possibilities. Capable of all possibilities to become manifest. So if there is seemingly feelings of sadness or depression, there is believing in the pseudo-ego-ing process and continuance of it. There is dreaming. There is not seeing the reality of your true self. Or else there would be no sadness, there would be no depressioning, seeming. And it would not manifest in seeming body sensations and contracting. There would be no belief in it, and it would dissolve. All that comes from belief in what is not real. And in its worst extreme cases, that leads to suicidal ideation, thought content, feelings of that if the body were not there, then that would be the way it would stop, etc. And all of that, again, it's sickness. It's belief to extreme. Then there are feelings such as being stuck or trapped or stagnant and wanting to get out of that. Again, there's the belief in being stuck. And what is that referencing? To whom is it referring? Who is stuck? The true self God is not stuck. So it refers to the pseudo-selfing. So belief in that perpetuates those feelings. This is damaging to the seeming body, to have to go through all of this because of a believing process. It gets inundated. It's like the body system is like the ramifications is like it's a battle. It can feel like the body is being beat up by the thought process. Because every time there is a thought that is believed that is not true, it's a blow to the body system. That's what it feels like. But seemingly there is not awareness of this process. If there is disengagement, it becomes obvious how thoughts affect body and body affects thoughts, processing, etc. Seemingly. So there is no one that is stuck, trapped, or in a stagnant situation, or there is nothing that is stagnant in God reality. All flows and constantly is moving. Any such feelings of being trapped is an illusion. Now it has to be said at this point, if there is actual seeming physical violence going on, seemingly of one against another, or entrapment actually in seeming space of a body against God will. If there are seemingly situationings going on like that, then there needs to be assistance. This is about what seems to be thought content processing that gives the illusion of like mental entrapment. But if there's actual seeming, again, physical, when speaking about actual seeming body phenomenon, again, there's no partitioning of it in God reality. It's all seamless. But if there's actual physical entrapment of a body against God will, that there needs to be asking for assistance for the body to get out, God in the form of, to get out of that entrapment, get out of that situation, because nobody should be harmed. SATYAVEDISM teachings are about nonviolence. So this is not seemingly any excuse to say there is no such thing as being trapped, so let the body be in a situation where it's being harmed and not allowed to go freely. No, this is not what is being spoken about. This is about thought, idea, God, the content that keeps reconfiguring, that is the pseudo self-limitation of what would be called mental thought. That is an illusion. It needs to be dropped. It is not real. And then there is anger, criticism, hostility, another seeming category of emotions and feelings generated by thought. When there is no sense of any pseudo-entities that are other, when that becomes apparent that all of that is not real, then there are no others to be angry at. There is nothing to criticize. There is nothing to rebuke. Any feelings of hostility drop. There is no person that has those feelings. There is no feeling in the body, seeming body, that no longer generates. The thought processings die away, and that those feelings that had been caused by, seemingly by those thoughts, dissolve. The outcome of that would be that the seeming body starts to feel the heaviness lift of all that emotioning caused by the beliefing. All that frustration. All of these feelings that directly affect the seeming body adversely and cause all sorts of malfunctionings within the system, the body networking system. All of that gets lifted. But again, it is not your body. It is not you. That is just fallout from the non-believing anymore in any of that fiction. So the pasting, there's no longer belief in pasting, and there's no longer belief in futuring. Of a seeming person, or of persons, or of various groups, or whatever, locations, etc. All of that seeming content can be referenced in an entirely new, entirely real way. All of that phenomena and functioning feelings of disempowerment or empowerment. What is disempowered? Who is disempowered? Who is empowered? Or apathy, detachment, isolation. There is no one to be disempowered. But the seeming solution to disempowerment is not power, being empowered. It is still not referencing the correct self, the real self. So there is no person to become empowered from having been disempowered. Yes, it might seem to be an improvement within fiction, but it is still dreaming. There is no person that becomes empowered. So yes, it is an improvement, but it is still dreaming. And self-realization even, it does not lead to seemingly apathy or detachment or isolation. But those feelings of the belief in the pseudo-self, that feeling, the feeling of apathy, of not, is a form of feeling disempowered or more neutralized, somewhere in between empowerment and disempowerment. Just not caring one way or another. Being detached or feeling isolated or not part of something anymore, being withdrawn. Again, the pseudo-self is being referenced here, the pseudo-selfing process, believing in the thought, that information. That refers to what is apathetic. And then even such emotions or feelings as happiness or love, exhilaration, or group unity. Unitive consciousness. Feeling, quote, like we are all one. It's still grouping. Who is the we? If it's based on experience or an object, it's fiction. Feelings of happiness and exhilaration, etc. Anything that is basically experiential, experienced by an entity and dependent upon an object for seeming happiness or exhilaration, etc. Or that feeling of, even that feeling of reaching for, if this seeming event occurs, then, quote, I will be happy or satisfied or whatever. Again, that's the pseudo-self being referenced. Pseudo-selfing. Belief that something has to occur in order for, that happiness is contingent upon something or other occurring, or some object being procured in order to get that sort of satisfaction. So even feelings, thought content, and thus feelings and emotioning about it, that sort of happiness, exhilaration, etc., or even love, that need to be loved by seemingly another, that is referencing the false self process. It's fiction and should be dropped. Knowing God as the true self, the God I, all seeming, there is no one to have happiness, but it will seemingly manifest as joy and happiness. It will seemingly appear that way, perhaps. But all identification with I, or I am happy, or we is dreaming. Unity consciousness is dreaming. There is nothing to be unified. It all is whole, God whole. Already, there's no need to have any unity. So this pasting and this futuring, if it is referring to the false identity and the species-centric information, it is dreaming. There is all limitless God manifesting that is seemingly occurring as future eventing, but it is not, and never is in the future. It is always in the now, eternally. So all God manifesting as God creativity it becomes manifest in the God visioning. The God visioning, and it seems to projection into what would be called a future, but there is no future. So there is no contradiction in that. All seeming future eventing is God visioning within and God manifesting always now in eternity. And it should always be expressed as any eventing or any visioning as God willing. And God willing does not mean God, any individual willing. It is God whole willing, always. That is why there is no individual free will, because there are no individuals to have it. There's only God will, God whole will. So all of the the fictional, the pseudo-selfing, and various other forms of thought fiction are to evaporate into God's silence. So there doesn't have to be fighting with the thoughts or combating the fictional thoughts, because that is resistance. And resistance is a fictional manifestation as well. It is a reaction to the thoughts by creating thoughts or feelings that counteract and thus continue fictioning in some other formationing. So it's endless. It's endless how fiction can create more fiction. Even if it's feeling like there's getting out of fiction. Again, there's no one to get out of it. The one that seemingly is wants to get out of it has to dissolve along with the fictioning, because it's fiction too. So all of this has to evaporate into God's silence. So it is best not to resist, because resisting is fiction. God consciousness allows all possible thoughts, all possible outcomes, all God manifestation, all possibilities, all that can be thought of and more, much, much more, because there is so much more of God manifesting beyond thought. Of course, God's speech and God's thought needs to be expressed, but there is so much more of God that is within God's silence as God manifestation, God manifesting. So let the thoughts that are the misidentification with fictional thought dissolve. Just thought comes. It's not about the real self. 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 It's not about me. It's not about God, me. It's not about, nope, But it's not about battling that. It's about dropping it. Let the thoughts glide by. Let the thoughts zoom by. Let the let the thoughts arise and let the thoughts seemingly incoming seem to have full force. Boom, let all the various thoughts expressed in text, in seeming sound, as the seemingly resonate. However, whatever the whether it seems to be a storm phenomenon. Again, the seemings. There are very few metaphors or analogies that suit this seeming purpose of expression, but it may seem very much like that there's in awareness for self-realization, that in awareness there is the sky that is completely spotless, completely clear, with no cloud or any phenomenon occurring in it whatsoever. That would be likened to meditation without any thought and without any feelings and without any sensations, etc. Or that there might be storms going on in the sky that are all sorts of lightning and thunder, etc. But yet the sky is it's untouched by it. The awareness is still clear, no matter what is going on in it. If the awareness, the sky, as having no identification with whatever the cloud formations and whatever the weather happens to be. That can be seen too. But the weather, in that case, is contingent, seemingly, upon, in a sense, believing in the weather. Continuing the process. So the clouds, they'll start to break up and clear, etc. It's an analogy, but it does not really express this. Investigation is the way to see. But God consciousness is beyond any belief whatsoever. Not just about the fictioning, the primary points of fictioning that are being referenced over and over again, because there is such intense belief in that content. There are seeming bodies that seem to come and go, that never seem to get out of that belief, that processing. So if there's wanting to get out, feelings of wanting to get out of all the fiction, quote the Matrix, etc., all that, and to get to reality, to what is actually occurring, and then beyond what seems to be actual, because what seems to be actual has to do with referencing the manifesting, the eventing, the phenomening, the synchro-eventing, etc. So what seems to look, what seems to be visible or whatever, and God primarily is beyond visibility. So reality and God reality refers to the whole reality, including what would be called God Absolute. God Absolute is ambiguous. God Absolute, well, actual God Absolute, of course, is beyond that all. But the terminology, God Absolute, is ambiguous in that it is God transcendence, meaning above and beyond God manifestation, and God Absolute Whole, which means including God manifestation within it. So that is used as covering both. But when God Absolute is referred to, is primarily referring to the Absolute, God Transcendent. And awareness is beyond that. Awareness is within it. God Absolute is beyond what is called awareness. But awareness has to be realized. That is a breakthrough. When awareness is realized, but then the language and seeing through the what would be considered the ego death. It's not, there's no ego there to die. It's the thought, the belief in the pseudo-egoing thought process that dies. It no longer reconfigures. And then that leads to all of the rest of it. All of the belief in all of the other components of the dream. Already enumerated. And there are many more, actually. But it's not a matter of endlessly investigating various categories. It basically is ultimately the non-belief in any belief. No more believing about anything, about any content. God is beyond belief, truly. So one of the many integral methods for meditation, there are various forms of seeming meditation. So one of the forms of meditation would simply be that any thought that came up would be discarded. So that's beyond deconstruction even. That would be any belief, any thought that would come up would not be believed in, period. So a thought would come up, another thought, not me, not God, not God, not God myself, not God myself, not God myself. You looking for freedom? Freedom. Freedom from any belief whatsoever. Not for the pseudo-self, though. This has to be really wanted. It's really intense. This may not be what you pseudo-self want. May not want to go there. Seriously. It's God willing. It's a God choice to want to actually know God directly. This is not for the week of the pseudo week of heart. This is intense. And can't go back. There's no one to go back. So be forewarned. You have to ask, who would be afraid? Who is being courageous? Even that, even when you get to that, who's going to be the hero to go through this? Ever heard the expression, what's seen can't be unseen? Something similar to that. This is the ultimate freedom. And you'll be God, reality. God, absolute reality, all in its grand wonder. It's amazing wonder. So this is about dropping thoughts, all these thoughts and feelings that are not real. It involves any pseudo-self that has any feelings of embarrassment or what will so-and-so think, and what's going to happen after something occurs, and how is there going to be reaction to others, and again, am I going to be alone, and is this going to be difficult, and whatever, any seeming projections or fears or reservations or almost any thoughts about it whatsoever. The fact that there is anything called self-realization, that there is anything called God realization, that the event takes place. In other words, nothing ever happened to you as God, the Absolute. So all of the seeming projections, again, would just be pseudo-self-fictioning. Oh, do not worry about the body hallucination that seems to be yours but is not. The various teachings also involve care for the seeming body, even though there should be no thought that it is you. thoughts for the caring for all bodies, the caring for even what seem to be inert or inanimate object bodies or whatever. It is all God, and it is all cared for equally. It'll all be cared for. There should be no worries about that. Worries are projections. They're pseudo projectioning. The teachings, some of them will go into this and cover extensively purification and detoxification of the seeming body. This is very important. Because since thought affects body and body affects thought, then the care and health of the seeming body hallucination is important in that it will affect thought processing as well. So purification of body teachings are to be expressed. There are teachings that already exist about this. For instance, teaching Lssv 73, which is about the guidelines of veganism in SATYAVEDISM, etc. The pranayama teachings, etc. There should be no fear that not believing in a body is somehow or another going to be detrimental to functioning. Or that not believing fictional thought content is somehow or other going to make thought not able to occur, etc. Any sorts of fears about this, about these. And projectioning about what could happen because of this. There's no pseudo-personality to say, rest assured, have no worry. There'll be freedom beyond all of that. Already is. Any moment in eternity can break right into seemingly out of dream. So yes, these teachings may appear to feel or seem radical, but there are many other teachings that, when in conjunction, may seem to allay such possible worrying that would be fictional. This is all of God beneficence. There should be no fear. God is beyond fear. So when thoughts keep arising, continue to ask, whom or what do these thoughts refer? To whom? To what? It's actually to what? The pseudo-self would be to who. But even that is not a who. It's a process. This is why the speaking is occurring. It's flowing out over and over again. It may seem repetitive in its seeming variations or whatever, but this is this constantly, this absorption in God consciousness for effect, for activation. So what is being referenced? The false self or the true self? The God self or the fiction? Now, this is an important sub-teaching. This is about the pseudo-egoing, but as spiritual ego. This is when the pseudo-egoing process as seeming person gets hijacked by the pseudo-egoing process as spiritual identity. Perhaps it's a spiritual soul, an individual soul, a belief in an individual soul, and that is myself or something, which is fiction. There is only one soul. It's the God soul, God absolute. There are no individual souls. This is truth. So, spiritual pseudo-egoing sort of replaces what would be called conventional pseudo-egoing process, where the thought content is certain limitations upon thought content drop, and then other seeming thought content is introduced and becomes assimilated and becomes part of the thought processing. And then this has to do with all the stories of the pseudo-ego, all the spiritual stories, all the journey of the spiritual ego, or the spiritual soul, the spiritual individual soul, whatever it thinks it is, or whatever that it isn't, it is not. So this would be all the spiritual paths, all the spiritual history, all this spiritual accumulated spiritual knowledge as information, the spiritual stories and narratives, the speaking about the progress on the spiritual path, or the lack of progress, or the breakthroughs on the spiritual path, or whatever, the spiritual narratives, the peak spiritual experiences, the reference. There's a tendency to get into referencing these peak experiences, and they'll be, again, this is all memory. This is all fictional processing, because it's pasting. It's spiritual pasting. It's still pasting. It's still pasting about a pseudo-ego entity, but this time it's whatever in eternity. It's considered a spiritual entity. It morphs into another entity. It's basically the same. It's the same process, but other information. And then it even goes into past lives, past spiritual lives, or past regular seeming lives, and spiritual progress in between one spiritual life and another life. So it's narrative, but it's not even narrative about a particular timeline of one seeming body, but it's narratives about multiple timelines and multiple seeming bodies that somehow or other are in relation to one seeming self that is speaking about the other histories of and creating this grand narrative of not only just one timeline, but many, or seeming a pseudo-ego that is coming from some other planet storyline narrative. It all has to do with being an individual, regardless of belief in being an individual. And somehow or other there's it's the same process with different fiction. all about accessing memories, or having taken on accumulated information and morphing it around, and reconfiguring it in order to create all these more and more stories. More and more stories. It's spiritual dreaming. Experiences are not God realization. There is much that is occurring, God manifestation as a whole. But if there is believing in identification with individualness, and narrative and stories about that identification, then it's dreaming. So that has to be let go as well. Even if you get beyond, whatever the false conceptualization about being on a particular planet, if there is false identification with being on a particular other planet, it's the same fictioning in a different form. That's all. There should be no identification with any of this. You as God do not have a spiritual path. You as God do not have individual histories. You as God do not have individual narratives. You are not the body and do not have narratives about it. Get out of the dream entirely. But not as an individual. And then, with all of the experimentation having to do with the use of psychedelic substances, or etc., various substances that are used in order to break open reality temporarily, to break open the fiction temporarily, to see glimpses of God reality. Again, it can be highly effective, but those are temporary seeming experiences, and then the windows, the breaking open starts to contract again. And then, so holding on to those two experiences is using thought again to claim those experiences. What is claiming those experiences as being yours? That is part of a spiritual identity. Again, a spiritual pseudo-egoing. Yes, that can be used for deconstruction, but only to a certain point, and then beyond it, it is limited. There should not be identification with certain experiences. It's as simple as that. There should be no identification with specific experiences, because that posits the pseudo-egoing as claiming those possession of those experiences. That's history. It's history. It's pasting. It's history, and history does not exist as such. Again, now, what is called shadow work, quote unquote, in spiritual fictioning? What is called shadow work? And also what is called spiritual bypassing. These are both fictional concepts, whether those concepts are spiritual or not, quote unquote. This is all within the dreaming. It's still within the fictioning. So they're both pseudo-egoing processings, and as such should be dropped. Now there's some speaking that shadow work, what is called shadow work, is necessary because otherwise there'll be spiritual bypassing, quote unquote. This is being addressed because it seems to be somewhat of a prevalent fictional manifestation, and it needs to be addressed. Otherwise, some of these teachings may appear to be what be considered misconstrued as encouragement of spiritual bypassing, but not so, because there has to be a pseudo-ego to be spiritually bypassing. There has to be a pseudo-ego believed in that would be spiritually bypassing. There would also have to be a pseudo-ego that would need shadow work performed. This is all within fiction. Perhaps it would be considered a higher level of fiction, but there is no such thing. There is either fiction or not fiction. There's either dreaming or reality. So this is dreaming. So shadow work, quote unquote, would be working on the various, what were aforementioned processes of what, sadness or apathy, etc., of various, seems to be mostly emotional, feelings of emotions, and how to work with those as being real, in order to reconfigure, to create some sort of health, of basically for the pseudo-egoing to continue, but in a more healthful manner. Or even what might be considered the pseudo-egoing soul formation, that somehow or other the soul would benefit from that clearing. But all of this posits that there's something real about it in order to engage it as being real enough to reconfigure it. And that is fiction. There is not anything there. There is no person there. Investigate and it will become obvious that there is no one there to be referenced. So the best way to deal with that is to not engage it and continue it as a process, whether it's reconfigured or not. Drop it. Shadow work, seemingly, and also most of what would be considered psychology, only works as long as there's belief that there's a person that needs that help. There's belief in the person. And then, as referenced, the spiritual bypassing. So there's this, the pseudo-egoing belief in as an ego. All right, the ego or the soul, same thing, pseudo. There's belief that shadow work, I'm above shadow work. I don't need that. That's not me. But yet even when there's a fictional egoing that believes that it's above shadow work. See, this is how convoluted it can get. Seriously. So the fictional pseudo-ego spiritual entity believes that it is above the need for shadow working because it is awareness. I am awareness, it says. I rest as awareness. I have to do a lot of effort and efforting involved in resting as awareness. But I am awareness. So I am above shadow work. Not necessary. But there's effort involved. There's still effort involved. Or there's still feelings in what seems to be a body. And those feelings are being ignored. It's an effort, it's a process, but there's efforting involved in ignoring those feelings. Those feelings are still trying to come up, and they're being pushed or down as not. I am awareness. I am awareness. There's no belief in that. Now be careful, because this may sound like the teachings heretofore being expressed, but there's a big difference here, because there's still a feeling somewhere of being an individual, despite what the wording is. This is important to be able to see how the pseudo-egoing process, how convoluted it can get. Seriously. So spiritual bypassing, yes, but the pseudo-ego is doing it, seemingly. The pseudo-egoing process is processing spiritual bypassing. In fiction. Still in the dream. There has not been realization, or else this would not be occurring. Shadow working occurring, spiritual bypassing occurring. These are still within the dream. They're thought-based, and there's still belief somewhere. If it's not belief in being a person, then it may be belief in being an individual soul. If it's not belief in being an individual soul, it could be that the body somehow or other is manifesting signs that there's some beliefing going on that may not be apparent. So if the body is having feelings of discomfort, those are signals also that it may not just be thought-based, that it may be on another level of thought that may not, and this will be, these are teachings that are to occur that have to do with the various forms of thought starting to manifest from the unmanifest. So this means that the further investigation has to go, in a sense, farther back into more subtle form of thought forming. And again, extensively, this must be approached and spoken of in detail. But for now, in eternity, we're dealing with the more what would be considered gross thought formations that are already seemingly formed into what would be called sentences, etc., whether they're manifest through words outwardly seeming or not. The more subtle formationings of thought may be being picked up by the body and starting to be felt. So if the investigation has not gone further back, in a sense, into emanation, then it may not be apparent why the body is still having these feelings, sensations, discomfortings, or whatever. So spiritual bypassing, there is evidence of some form or some other form of manifesting of repression and of if it's not readily apparent, that it's actually just ignoring thoughts, but yet believing somehow or other in them, despite seeming to feel like that they're being ignored. If any of that actually can get through. But regardless, what is called shadow work and what is called spiritual bypassing are both within the dream as spiritual fictioning. There's so much spiritual fictioning as well that is to be explored regarding what are called God, the happening of religions and spirituality in general, because those forms of fiction there has to be non-belief in as well. But ideally, in God reality, there is no, in practice, eventually there is no belief in any beliefs, in any fictional content whatsoever. Not needing elucidation. Just simply not belief, non-belief. So any stories or narratives that have anything to do with, say, I am trying, or I have been trying, to what is the I referring? God does not try. This has to be effortless, because in fact, it is effortless. There is no trying, it's effortless. In God reality, there is no effort. To be a parent, there has to be seeing through stories and narratives. There has to be disassembling of disidentifying with thoughts about mind and body, disidentifying from feelings that are body and based and etc., species fiction based, etc. Disidentification from images of replications of images of say digital representations of body. Of course, eventually, those exist. Those are in God networking. The bodies are appearing in seamless whole God reality. But if there is identification with, say, photographs of the body image or whatever, that again, that sort of seems to be prevalent in information exchanging, etc. Again, that would be referred to the first of the five in SSSV 68. Body identification. Say God in the form of photographs can exist and there can be no identification with it. This is true. No identification with it. not need to be. There does not need to be identification with any fictional information in order for functioning to occur. Otherwise, it just creates more the momentum and the energies that go in that direction in order to create more of it. So it has to be non-belief and redirection of energies, deprogramming. There's plenty of God truth information in the form of such activities as sciencing, etc. That's quantifiable God information. Again, some of it is fiction as well, but it is all to be seen through. It becomes very apparent what is and what isn't is not. So this is about God, direct knowledge, and not accumulated information. Because what is accumulated can be unaccumulated. What can be experienced can be dissipated. So it is the relinquishing of belief in the thought narratives, the false narratives, not believing what is not real, and dropping of personal history and the seeming personal histories of seeming others as well, not having no interest. That does not mean that there is no interest in God in the form of, in God, in the seeming form of. The very seeming names referenced, but there is no interest in the personal dream history of such, because there is no person at core. It is all eternally now, and all of the happenings are occurring now. So there is seeming interest in what is occurring now in eternity, and love of God life. Without any dreaming narratives. So what it'll feel like in engaging in this seeming practices or processings is that there might become more silence, which is pointing toward God reality. Such as this. The silence in between these words that is actually permeating the words as well becomes more apparent. And seeming feeling of listening more, instead of having the thoughts bombarding for the next thought, interrupting thoughts, interrupting what seem to be incoming or exiting thoughts, etc., all seamlessly within God consciousness. There will be no feeling of needing to jump in and interrupt thoughts, like sort of forcefully coming and like seemingly counteract other thoughts. There's silence, and there'll seem to be more listening, actually absorbing. Again, those thoughts then investigate. When there's more silence and there seems to be more space to investigate the thoughts for veracity. Actually, it's an investigation of thought veracity. And then non-belief, again, but without resistance, because there is no one to resist. Awareness does not resist. God consciousness does not resist. All is allowed. There's no separation. So, again, Om. Nothing has ever happened to you as God absolute. Absorb. Om. 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 God does and does not simultaneously. Om. God noumenon and God phenomenon. Om. God absolute and God manifest. God zero and God one. Om. Paravak Shakti. Om. Satyanandam. Om. Tat Sat. Om, Om, Om.